You know, we spend a massive portion of our adult lives just, well, fiercely defending our
Oh,
opinions.
absolutely. We really do.
We argue on the internet, we let tensions simmer at family dinners, and we build our entire identities around what we are absolutely certain is right and true.
Right.
But I mean, what if the very foundation of all that conviction isn't even yours?
That is the big question, isn't it? Because if you look closely at how the human brain actually develops, the software currently running your reality was, installed without your permission.
Wow.
Yeah, long before you even had the neurological capacity to operate the machine yourself.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping straight into the deep end here with an incredibly provocative premise that we found woven through a whole stack of sources today.
It is a pretty wild premise, honestly.
It really is. And our core mission today is pulling that premise apart. The focus is this. Before you can think, they taught you what to believe. Whatever you believe about yourself and others, it is not true.
Which is just a profound, almost destabilizing statement. But we are living in an era where understanding this mechanism is just no longer optional. For you listening right now, just consider the sheer volume of information overload you face the minute you look at your phone.
Oh, it is exhausting. Just nonstop.
Right. And understanding exactly how your mind physically processes reality and, recognizing the hidden filters dictating that process, well, that is the only way to avoid being constantly manipulated by the world around you.
So to figure out how those filters are built, we are pulling from a surprisingly unified stack of sources today. We are crossing modern cognitive psychology with the centuries-old wisdom of ancient mystics.
A really fascinating combination.
Yeah, and then we are tying that historical through line into contemporary analysis from Joe Banger's book, Finding Neve. Basically, we are fundamentally deconstructing how your identity is assembled.
And I think the best place to start is at the absolute beginning. To grasp why your deeply held beliefs might not actually be true in an objective sense, we have to examine the mechanical process.
Like how a belief is actually installed.
Exactly. How it gets installed in a developing brain.
Let's walk through that chronological timeline. When you are a child, you are essentially a sponge. You absorb ideas from your parents, your religious community, your cultural environment, schools, the media playing in the background.
Right, they are just soaking it all in.
Yeah, a child doesn't stop and analytically ask, hey, is what mom's saying about that group of people objectively true?
Well, they physically cannot. A young child doesn't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex.
Which is the critical reasoning part, right?
Exactly. It's the area of the brain responsible for complex critical reasoning. But more importantly, a child's literal survival depends entirely on trusting authority figures.
Right, because if a toddler decides to be a skeptic and ignore their parents, they might just wander straight into traffic.
Precisely. The brain is evolutionarily wired to accept the tribe's reality as absolute truth, because belonging to the tribe is the only way to stay alive.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the brain takes those external inputs, right? The opinions of parents, the local culture, and it uses them as the foundational building blocks for an identity. But how do those loose ideas turn into the really rigid convictions we see in adults?
Well, psychologists have mapped out a very specific progression for this. It starts with repeated exposure. The thoughts you absorb over and over again from your environment, they become assumptions.
Like a baseline.
Right. An assumption is a mental shortcut. Your brain no longer spends energy evaluating the idea, and over time, as you build a life upon those assumptions, they harden into convictions.
Wow.
And this is the crucial mechanism here. Eventually, those convictions begin to physically shape your perception. By the time you reach adulthood, you believe you're making conscious, rational choices, but largely, you were just running on autopilot through layers of inherited conditioning.
It is like, imagine being born and the very first thing that happens is someone forces you to put on a pair of deeply altered prescription glasses.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. They belong to someone else. Maybe they're your grandfather's glasses or your culture's glasses. They're tinted, maybe heavily warped.
But you don't know that.
Exactly.
Oh.
Because you have worn them since day one, you never realize the world isn't naturally blurry or green tinted. You just think, well, that is just what reality looks like.
What's fascinating here is that your brain functions like an optometrist who actively refuses to check if the prescription is wrong.
Wow. Yeah. Cognitive psychology calls this confirmation bias, doesn't it?
It does, but we really need to understand how it operates mechanically. The human mind cannot process the billions of bits of raw data hitting its senses every second. it would just crash.
It's too much.
Way too much. So it relies on those glasses as a filtering system, which is constructed from your memories, your inherited emotions, and your fears.
So it's actively sorting the data.
Aggressively.
Yeah.
Your brain seeks out evidence that proves your inherited glasses are showing you the actual world. And at the exact same time, it unconsciously and instantly deletes or distorts any contradictory information before it even reaches your conscious awareness.
It's an invisible sieve. It only lets in the facts that fit the predetermined narrative.
Exactly.
And when you look at depth psychology, particularly Carl Jung, the mechanics of this get even darker. Jung argued that human behavior is largely driven by the unconscious mind, specifically dealing with how we handle the things we don't want to admit about ourselves.
Right. Jung's concept of projection explains so much of our daily conflict. Confronting your own inner darkness, your insecurities, or, realizing that your core beliefs might be built on a lie is incredibly painful.
Oh, it is terrifying.
It really is. And the brain treats that psychological pain the exact same way it treats physical pain. It tries to escape it.
Like pulling your hand off a hot stove.
Exactly like that. To avoid the agony of inner examination, people externalize their flaws. If you feel secretly powerless, you might project that outward by becoming obsessed with how a particular political group is trying to control you.
You create a clear enemy so you just don't have to look in the mirror. You build rigid dogmas and strict narratives of us versus them.
Because an unexamined mind craves certainty much more than it craves truth. Ideology gives the ego a profound, synthetic sense of security. It hands you a script that tells you exactly who you are, what your purpose is, and who the bad guys are.
Which totally explains the sheer visceral intensity we feel when someone challenges our opinions. We don't just feel like we're losing a polite debate about tax policy or theology. We feel like we are under a physical attack.
Yeah, the body's threat response doesn't distinguish between a tiger chasing you and a coworker dismantling your worldview.
That is wild.
Questioning deeply rooted beliefs feels psychologically threatening because your ego's entire self-image is supported by those underlying assumptions. If the belief falls, well, the identity feels like it will collapse too.
It is a house of cards.
Right. The danger, as psychology points out, isn't simply having beliefs. The danger is operating on unconscious beliefs. A child raised in a fearful household becomes an anxious adult. A child taught that questioning authority is dangerous grows up to suppress their own curiosity.
And those patterns just run continuously for decades without the person ever realizing they didn't write the code.
Exactly.
Now, modern psychologists use clinical terms for this, like cognitive bias, unconscious conditioning, projection. But our sources show that humanity has actually known about this trap for centuries. The vocabulary was just different.
Right. Psychologists study the structure of the mind, mapping the mechanics of the brain. Historical mystics investigated consciousness directly through rigorous introspection, meditation, and spiritual exploration.
And despite living in wildly different cultures and eras, they reached the exact same conclusions about human conditioning.
They absolutely did.
The cross-cultural parallels in the texts we reviewed are genuinely staggering. You have ancient Eastern traditions calling this state Maya, which translates roughly to the illusion of mistaken perception. The idea that what you see is a projection, not reality.
Yes.
You have mystical Christianity repeatedly referring to spiritual blindness. You have Sufi teachings that describe humanity as literally being asleep, walking around completely unaware of their deeper nature. They all arrived at the insight that most people are trapped in a prison of conditioned thinking.
And we see the exact same philosophy anchoring ancient Greece. When Socrates declared that the unexamined life is not worth living, it wasn't intended to be a catchy motivational quote for a coffee mug.
Right, it wasn't just a nice thought.
No, it was a revolutionary, incredibly dangerous idea at the time. He understood that unless you consciously interrogate your inherited assumptions, they will completely govern your existence.
Socrates basically argued that genuine wisdom only begins the exact moment you recognize the absolute limits of your own inherited knowledge. And the mystical solution to this conditioned prison was awakening. That process starts by simply observing your own mind. You train yourself to stop automatically accepting every thought that pops into your head as an objective fact.
Right, you create some distance.
Yeah, you start separating your authentic perception from your programmed false identities. The labels society gave you, like your race, religion, nationality, or social status.
Exactly.
But I have to push back a little here. It is really easy to dismiss this as just ancient, abstract philosophy. How is this mystical awakening practically different from just going to a modern therapist and working through your cognitive biases?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the difference is the ultimate destination. Therapy usually seeks to make the ego healthier, to help you function more smoothly within society, and to reduce your immediate suffering.
Which is great.
Of course. But the mystics pushed far beyond functional improvement. They aimed for a complete transformation of consciousness itself.
Right.
They warned that the ego, that bundle of inherited beliefs, fundamentally convinces individuals that they are separate from everyone else. So when you start peeling away those programmed identities, the fear you experience isn't just the fear of being wrong in an argument.
What is it then?
It feels like the fear of losing your existence entirely.
Oh.
The mystics were quite literally teaching people how to survive the psychological death of their conditioned identity.
Man, that is heavy. But if that is the cure, we have to look at what happens when society refuses to take the medicine, when people can't let go of that identity, when the unconscious conditioning goes completely unchecked and the fear of losing that identity takes over, well, we get fanaticism.
Yes, we do.
And our sources define fanaticism in a very specific, mechanical way. It isn't just having a strong belief. It is the psychological fusion with a belief.
Fusion is the exact right term there, because having a strong belief means you hold an idea to be true based on your current understanding. Fusion means the idea and your sense of self have merged into one entity.
They become inseparable.
Completely. And when identity and ideology become inseparable, rational discussion dies instantly. It does not matter how much empirical evidence or airtight logic you present to a fanatic, because evidence cannot dissolve an emotional attachment.
They aren't defending an idea anymore.
No, they are fighting for their survival.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Bring this into the reality of everyday life for you listening. Think about your habits, specifically doom scrolling.
Oh, yes, the modern trap.
Right. Think about the modern technology we interact with constantly. Social media algorithms are engineered by behavioral scientists to exploit this exact psychological vulnerability. They reward outrage, absolute certainty, and tribal identity because those emotions keep your eyes on the screen.
And those algorithms actively hijack the amygdala.
The fear center of the brain.
Right, the fear center. They construct these bespoke echo chambers that severely damage our mental flexibility and actively increase hostility.
It is by design.
It is. When you are consumed by that level of algorithmic ideological certainty, you lose the ability to distinguish objective reality from your own emotional projection. Every piece of news just confirms what you already desperately wanted to be true.
And history repeatedly demonstrates the catastrophic danger of this fusion when it happens on a massive collective scale. Political leaders and institutions have known for millennia how to weaponize fear to control populations.
Because fear shuts down the prefrontal cortex.
Exactly. It suppresses critical thinking.
Yeah.
Complex, highly nuanced realities are intentionally reduced to rigid, simplistic narratives. It is good versus evil, the pure believer versus the dangerous outsider.
And what should truly keep us awake at night is that under the influence of these collective unconscious beliefs, ordinary people can justify immense cruelty.
That is the scary part.
They can support horrific division, all while sincerely, deeply believing they are morally righteous.
That is honestly the most terrifying element of this entire deep dive. The worst damage in history wasn't done by cartoon villains twirling their mustaches. It was done by regular people who were absolutely certain they were the good guys.
And we often make the mistake of assuming that information alone creates wisdom. We think if people just read more books or got better degrees, they would be less fanatic.
Right, like education is the magic bullet.
But highly educated people can still be completely trapped by unconscious biases. An educated mind that lacks self-awareness simply uses its vast vocabulary to build more sophisticated, complex rationalizations for its conditioned fears.
So if our biology and our algorithms are both working against us, how do we break the loop without losing our minds? This is where Joe Bandra's framework in his book Finding Neve provides a roadmap.
It is a very practical framework, too.
It is. Bandra points out a fundamental flaw in our development. Society teaches individuals what to think long before it ever teaches them how to think.
And as a direct result of that flaw, he argues the greatest prison humanity faces isn't physical confinement. The greatest prison is our own unconscious conditioning. Bandra refers to this state as a psychological and symbolic hallucination.
Let's clarify what he means by that, because
Yeah.
he isn't talking about a clinical psychosis where you're seeing things that aren't physically there.
No. He means that people are perceiving the world entirely through rigid, imposed narratives rather than experiencing reality directly.
Okay, I see.
When someone in this state walks down the street, they don't see a complex human being. They see a symbol. They see a liberal, a conservative, a threat, an ally. They are hallucinating categories that were programmed into them.
To break out of that symbolic hallucination, Bandra says the requirement is radical self-investigation. We have to start interrogating the origin of our thoughts, asking yourself why you believe what you believe. Are your deepest convictions actually rooted in empirical truth? Or are they just rooted in tradition, the fear of being ostracized by your family, or the desperate desire for social approval?
And committing to those questions is incredibly uncomfortable.
It has to be.
As we discussed earlier, it destabilizes the very identity structures you have relied on to feel safe your whole life. It can cause profound confusion, existential uncertainty, and intense loneliness as you physically and mentally step away from the consensus of your tribe.
But this painful destabilization is the absolute prerequisite for growth.
It is the only way through.
So what does this all mean? Does questioning everything mean we have to give up our morals? Do we have to abandon our spirituality and become empty, cynical nihilists who believe in nothing?
This raises an important question, and it is a very common trap. But the answer is no. Neither psychologists, nor the mystics, nor Bandra advocate for abandoning all beliefs.
Right, because if you just reject everything reflexively, you end up in emotional emptiness or sheer paranoia.
Exactly. Healthy inquiry is about the refinement of belief. Questioning your inherited assumptions doesn't destroy your spirituality. It clears the debris so you can achieve a much deeper, authentic spirituality.
Because you aren't just practicing blind obedience anymore, you actually chose it.
Precisely. Spiritual and psychological maturity involves integrating reason, your intuition, and rigorous self-awareness. It is the exact opposite of surrendering to a blind ideology. The goal is to refine your understanding continually.
Making it your own.
Right. Mature beliefs are not brittle. They remain flexible and open to new evidence. They naturally produce humility because you constantly recognize the limits of your own perspective.
That makes a lot of sense.
And most importantly, mature beliefs produce compassion rather than hatred. They expand your awareness of how interconnected we all are, rather than narrowing your worldview into a paranoid us versus them.
It makes me think of holding a belief with an open hand versus a clenched fist. If your hand is clenched tightly around an idea, you can't examine it. You're just ready to punch anyone who tries to take it from you.
That is a great visual.
But if you hold that same idea in an open hand, you can look at it from different angles, you can share it, and you can let it evolve.
That imagery captures the exact distinction between fusion and healthy conviction. The search for truth must be a living, breathing process, not a fixed, defensive conclusion you reached 10 years ago.
Synthesizing the journey we've gone on today, it starts with a really jarring realization. Your initial beliefs were inherited, not chosen. They were installed into your operating system before you had the defenses to evaluate them.
Right.
But the incredibly empowering news is that cognitive psychology, ancient mysticism, and contemporary thinkers like Joe Bandra all point to the exact same cure. Self-awareness is the only path to true freedom. You do not have to stay trapped in the programming.
And this is far more than just a philosophical exercise for a Sunday afternoon. This is the existential challenge of our time. Beliefs shape perception. Perception shapes human behavior. And that behavior shapes the physical world.
It scales up massively.
Entire civilizations rise and fall based on whether their collective belief structures remain stubbornly unconscious or whether individuals courageously choose to examine them. The ultimate question you have to ask yourself every single day is whether your beliefs are chosen consciously by you or simply inherited unconsciously from the past.
We want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Something to physically test out in your own life this week. The next time you feel a sudden, intense flash of anger or absolute certainty during an argument, maybe you're debating someone online, maybe things get heated with a partner over dinner, just pause.
Just stop for a moment.
Exactly. Ask yourself, is this emotion actually yours? Or is it just a programmed response, a ghost of an inherited belief from a childhood authority figure, echoing loudly in your mind? What would happen if you didn't fight back, but just watched that emotion pass? Maybe, just for a second, you could take off those warped prescription glasses and see the world clearly for the very first time.